But then there are people who want that money from you. Like the people who own the apartment that you rent, they want to get paid. It's obnoxious. They're people that you buy a car from, they want to get paid. People who you buy food from, they want to get paid. And then the reality sets in, and you really want to just be with your mommy again. You, you wanted to get out of high school, get out of college, or whatever, get out of the house, or not get out of the house now. That's a big thing. I'm not leaving. I don't know what parents do with that. It's really interesting today, but there are a lot of things that happen when we start thinking about money, and we fly into this really fast. I mean, when you're in middle school or high school, you think the day of freedom will never come. But I'm telling you, when it comes, and it comes fast, and it comes hard, and all you're doing is looking at the paycheck, looking at the two numbers, looking at the rent, and you're in it. You're in the money, and it causes a whole lot of challenges. I just read this really interesting book. It's called The Psychology of Money. I think it's on the New York Times bestseller list. And at the end of the book, there's this entire chapter on the history of the psychology of money in Americans, in our country. And it was really interesting. Today, September 4, 93 years ago, something happened in this country. And it rocked not only this country, but the entire world. Wall Street crashed. They call it the Great Depression. And it destroyed the finance world. It destroyed money. This book says that check this out, much of what we think about money today in the families in America goes back to 93 years ago and what started on September 4, 1929. A lot of things happened with that. The playing field leveled. The rich became poor. The poor became poor. Nobody really had anything. Um, it was like that for a decade, 10 years of just food lines, bread lines, potato lines, where people just could hardly eke out a living. There's a phenomenon that took place, and it happened in my family, where parents couldn't take care of their children. They didn't have the finances to be able to take care of their children. And so they would farm out certain children in their families to go live with somebody else because they couldn't take care of them. My mother and her sister were farmed out to a distant relative about 100 miles from where her home was, and sent to a farm, and that's how she and her sister survived. It's hard to even imagine what was taking place during this long decade of absolute poverty. Awful, awful time. Then something happened 10 years after the crash, and it really changed the economy, and that was World War II. All of a sudden, the government hired 16 million people, mostly men, to go fight in the war. So all of a sudden, 16 million people who didn't have employment had a bed to sleep in, had food to eat, got a salary, and now they were shipped off all over the world to fight. But something else happened here at home. All of the old industrial factories, the antique factories, got reconditioned to make military equipment, guns, ammunition, airplanes, and those jobs were typically taken over by women. So you've got two-income families pretty much required that everybody get involved in this. And for the first time in a long time, people had food and money, all because of the war. They also had a lot of grief because 400,000 soldiers died U.S. soldiers died in that war, a massive loss. But the economy changed. The soldiers come home after the war. All the factories are built to build munitions, and there are no jobs because there's no need for munitions. So there was a short amount of time from 1945 to 1950-ish where people were wondering, are we going backwards? Are we going back to the Depression? But something was churning in this country. There were engineers and scientists and inventors who were coming up with some things that we now call stuff. And they were making stuff. We'd never had stuff before. You had horses and buggies and corn and outhouses. That's what you had. Now you have stuff. They made things like radios. They made toasters. They made refrigerators. They made freezers. They started making stuff. And wealthy people and poor people all needed the same stuff. There was a very little gap between finances with people these days. Everybody needed a refrigerator. How great living would be if you just had a refrigerator. My dad used to talk to me about the ice block guys, right? They drive in their wagons with a horse, and you get the ice blocks and stick them in the top of a refrigerator, which is where it got its name from. You're refrigerating, and this cold ice will kind of keep the milk semi-warm. But that's okay because the milkman's coming again tomorrow, right? And it all came out. The whole world changed. And by the end of 1950s into 1960, where my brain started working, stopped, shortly after, but I began to understand the world a little bit through stuff. Because one day we got a radio, and then we got a record player. This is cool stuff. I mean, nobody's ever seen this. You get a telephone. It just happened to be on a telephone line with 4 other houses called the party line. It was a nice way of just listening to all the stuff your neighbor was saying. Literally, if your neighbor got a phone call, you could lift up your phone if you were real quiet and listen to everything they said. And it was really bad when they started talking about you. But we needed stuff. But then things began to happen, and I want to read this. This is really interesting. The Great Divide starts here. The Psychology of Money says that Americans held on to 2 ideas rooted in the post-World War II economy. Number one, that you should live a life similar to most other Americans. Do we have that going on? How many iPhones in the room, right? Other people have that. This is like space age stuff now. How many of us have a nice car? How many of us have 2 cars? See, that's one of the things that happen. Stuff comes, and we just immediately adapt to stuff. This happened in the 60s. It's still happening. With one belch in 2008, this is the way it's been. Here's the second thing that happened. Taking on debt to finance that lifestyle became acceptable. Now, this was a divide. Wealthy people paid cash. Not so wealthy people got the same stuff, but they bought it on time. And it was from these 2 ideas that this book, The Psychology of Money, says this is where we have our picture of money. It's how we understand money. Now, I want to ask you a question today for you to answer for yourself. What is your picture of money? When you think about money, what do you think about? And I wrote down 4 things that I think come up in the American psyche with money. The first thing that I thought about is fear. There is a lot of fear as it relates to money. If you came from a poor family and you finally got your hands on some money, you live with a driven fear that you could fail and go back to where you came from. It's innate. It's not necessarily realistic. It's just a fear that's there. And you operate with this fear of money issue when you come from a poor home and now that you have some money, you can't imagine going back, but you live with the fear. If you came from a wealthier home, you have another fear. Can I keep up with where I came from? Or am I going to be the one kid in the family who just can't quite cut it? And so that becomes another fear. But fear is huge when it comes to money. Another picture we have of money is ownership. This is mine. I've worked for it, and by God, I'm going to keep it, and I'm going to keep it as long as I can. It's mine. It's my money. I would guess that every one of us struggle with this at least half of our time as we think about money. It's mine. I've worked on it. I got my own accounts. We've got stuff put away here. We've got trust over here. It's mine. Here's the next one. It's two words, really. It's esteem and value that I threw in here. With esteem, money makes us feel like we are pretty cool. And it's a pride issue. And so when we think about money, we think about, whoa, I'm looking a lot cooler than I used to, and a lot cooler than people around me. And that can get connected with fear, because what happens if you lose your money? You lose your esteem. Another thing that goes with this is value. You put your value wrapped around the money you have. Not everybody. I'm just saying that we know people who do this. My value is what I'm worth. If I don't have enough money, I'm not valuable. Some of you are sitting here today and you're struggling financially. You don't feel very valuable. And I just want to throw this in. That is a lie from Satan. And your value is not measured by your net worth. But as Americans, we have these things going on. And then there's the whole thing of the picture of money is simply survival. You don't really have a picture. You're just so busy trying to make ends meet and survive and adapt that's your picture that you haven't really thought about. Today, though, I want to give you some thoughts about money, not dictates, not rules, but hopefully I can inspire you with some principles from Scripture that would begin to take you to a better picture of money. Now, God has a picture of money, and it's probably a lot different than ours. So I'm going to give you 3 passages of Scripture. If you have a pen and a piece of paper, you won't need to write down the scriptures, the whole verses, but write down the passages where they are and look at them later, because I'm going to give you some things that are absolutely power-packed when it comes to God and money. The first one is Psalm 24, verse 1. And it says this: "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and everything in it." That's the first principle. And it means this: everything, God owns everything. He owns everything. You might say, "No, I own my house." You don't own your house. Even if you have it paid for, you don't own your house. And I can prove it. Quit paying your taxes. See what happens. You ever have a kid and, "Don't come in, this is my room." And you're like, "Hey, you little punk. It's not your room. This is my room. I bought this room. I bought that door. I can kick the door in." I got locked out of a bedroom last night from my granddaughter. 3 years old. Or 4. 2. I don't know. It was embarrassing. And she thought it was wonderful. "My room, Pappy." Okay. No, not her room. And, but it's not your room. Another proof it's not your house or your stuff. When you die, you get to take it with you. No, we already know that. So Psalm 24:1, God owns everything. Ephesians 4:7, this is so powerful. There's one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all, in all, and living through all. So not only does God own everything, he is in everything. Like he is in to your checkbook and your savings account and your 401k. He is in these things. He needs to, he doesn't need to, he does. He flows through all of this. Your job is to tap into him. Okay, Ephesians 4:7, I just read that. Here's the last one. This is, to me, the more I read it, the more powerful it becomes. Luke chapter 12, verse 16 to 21. And I'll just read it. Jesus told them a parable saying, the land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I'll do this. I'll tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. Now, up to this point, this is good stuff. It's good to have so many crops and so much grain, and you don't know what to do with it, and you can build bigger barns and put it in the bigger barns. But this next section is where it goes south. He goes, and I will say to my soul, right there is a problem. When you begin talking to yourself, your soul self, your selfish self, nothing good's going to come out of that. Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. What does that sound like? That sounds like the American dream. It's the dream that we all have been part of. We've been caught up in this. If I can just get enough money, make it good, get my stuff that I need, get my kids okay, everything works, get the nice house, and then I can just back off and retire and breathe, and everything's good. You know what happens when you retire? You die. But that should have been laughable. Thank you. I'm giving you freedom to laugh. But God said to him, fool, what happened here? What changed? God blessed him, and now he calls him a fool. This night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, listen to this, whose will they be? Who's this stuff going to belong to? And then he goes on, he says, so is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. What does it mean to be rich toward God? Well, it's simple. It's the opposite of laying up treasure for yourself. Rich toward God means using earthly riches to show how much you value God. This isn't tithing. This isn't putting something in the offering. It's an entirely new way to look at money. Different than what we've been taught, different than what we've read, different than what the Americana has pushed on us. God has a way for us to look at money that is different than anything else you've ever imagined. 3 stories, all 3 about my granddad. I don't know, it's 7, 8 years ago. Pam and I were invited to a conference in Winchester. It was a pastor's conference, and they had this very famous missionary pastor who came and spoke, and it was incredible. It was awesome. And at the end, they had this, you could get in this line, and all the pastors and their wives could go through, and this guy would pray for you. So Pam and I got in line, and we, walked through the line, and we got there, and we were being prayed for. And when the prayer was over, it was wonderful. I was inspired. I walked on through the line, and there were some pastors at the end of the line. I'm not sure why they were there. We had name tags. I hate name tags, but and your name was really big on the tag. And this guy came up to me, probably 20, 25 years older than me, and I knew who he was. I'd never met him, but he was a real famous pastor, pastored a church of thousands of people, and he led thousands of people to Jesus. And I was pretty excited to get to meet him. And he says, "I see your name tag, and are you any relation to Hartley Wigfield?" And I said, "Oh yeah, he's my dad." And he goes, "No, not. This guy would be older." I said, "Oh, it's my granddad." And he goes, "Did he plant churches? Was he a church planter?" And I said, "Yeah, he planted a lot of churches." He said, "Did he plant a church in Paw Paw, West Virginia?" That was a metropolis, if you ever been to Paw Paw. And I said, "Yeah." And he just starts crying. And through the tears, he said, "Your grandfather led me to Jesus when I was 11 years old. And he said, I watched your grandfather and decided I wanted to be a pastor." Now, this is a guy who changed the world around him. And it was my granddad's story. Paw Paw Church probably never had more than 25 people in it ever. Just a side note. I don't know, 2-3 years before COVID hit, my dad and I were going to go to an auction. We do that from time to time. We like to buy other people's stuff at half price. And so we were going to this auction. He called me up early Saturday. He said, "Hey, instead of going to the auction, I heard about this guy who has an old car up in the hills of West Virginia in a barn, and he wants to make a good deal to get rid of it. Do you want to go?" I said, "That sounds like fun." So we went to this farm. It took us forever to get there. And there were 3 barns. Nobody was there. He just said, "Hey, look through the barns. We'll find the car." And finally we came to this barn, and over in the corner was this huge pile. It looked like trash. It was blankets and boxes and stuff on top of the blankets. And I lifted up the blanket, and I saw this car, and we have a picture of the car. Yes, there it is. That was underneath the blanket. Now, it was a little dirty, and it needed a battery. And so we pulled it out, stuck a battery in it, and it started. And I fell in love with the car. And I knew the price. The price was so low. And I'm like, man, I can get this thing cleaned up and make some money. Pam's going to love this. Huge mistake in thought. And so, bought the car. That was on a Saturday. On Monday, I headed back to West Virginia, not having the best marital conversations over the weekend. And I give the guy the money, cash. He wanted cash. And he gave me the title, and my dad was with me. And the guy's name was David Hartley Kearns. And so my dad goes, "Where'd you get that name, that middle name?" And his wife spoke up and said, "Oh, he got that from a preacher. His mother named him after a preacher." And my dad was like, "Well, tell me about this." And she said, his parents were divorced. They were alcoholics. And this preacher started a church in Old Town, Maryland. And they came and got saved, and God delivered them from alcohol. They got remarried, and they had a little boy, and they named him David Hartley Kearns. It was my granddad who started that church. I came home trying to explain to my wife why I could never sell this car. I still have it. It's down in the basement garage. We're still having conversations. I'm making progress. About 3, 4 weeks ago, I wasn't here for quite a while. We had some family things happening, and Pam's mother passed away, and I was getting ready to fly to Charlotte to be with her when I found out that my dad had septic shock and was in ICU in Winchester. So I just turned around and went to Winchester to be with him, and he had a couple weeks of it was kind of sketchy whether or not he'd pull through, and so happy he did. He did great, and at the end of his hospital stay, he was talking to me, or he told me about this later. There was a nurse that came in and sat down in the chair in the room and was just talking to my dad. And she just said, "How is it that you can be 95 years old and you've had these medical conditions and you can still be happy and joyful and sweet? And how does that work?" And my dad's pat answer has always been, "It was the Lord." And I guess everybody's hoping that they know who the Lord is. And then he just went on and just said, "Hey, Jesus is my hope, my everything." And she said, "Well, he's mine too." And she said, "I've been going to church all my life. My parents got saved in this little church in Woodrow, West Virginia. And they got saved. They raised us kids in that church. And I'm raising my kids in that church. And we just love Jesus." And she says, she didn't tell him it was in Woodrow yet. And so he goes, where was the church? And she goes, "You wouldn't know. It's just a little place." And he said, "No, where was it?" And he goes, "Woodrow, West Virginia." Well, Woodrow, West Virginia is an intersection just left of Paw Paw. And he goes, "I know where it is." And my dad started a church there. And she said, "Well, what's the name of the church?" This nurse taking care of my dad, probably close to 100 years later, caring for my father and her family, her mom and dad, her and her children know Jesus because of something that my granddad did many, many years ago. Now, I want to give you some little things to consider with this history here. First of all, he planted approximately 12 churches. We're still checking on the numbers. 6 that he planted by himself, and a few more, most probably close to 6, that he did with other people. During the Great Depression, he planted these churches during the Great Depression. He and his wife, my grandmother, did pretty well during the Depression, so they began feeding the people in the community in South Cumberland, Maryland. She would cook soup and invite everybody over. She would fix bread and give it away. Their chickens had eggs, they gave them away. They took care of several blocks of people living in Cumberland, Maryland during the Depression. My grandfather bought a house, a duplex, and the family lived in one side. They rented out the other side. Then he bought the house next to it. Then he bought the house next to it. He had 6 houses that he bought all during the Depression. And my grandfather's job was this. He painted houses and put wallpaper up. That was his job. He was just a menial laborer, and he had this wall. He put, back in the day, you could put wallpaper on the walls, on the ceiling. He could do a whole house in one day. He was amazing. And the paper stayed up, unlike when I do it. But he just worked, and well, let me just tell you how this worked. Each of the churches that he planted, what he would do is find a community that didn't have a church at all. And every summer, he would take his wife and his children, and they would go live in that community. They'd stayed in a tent or a barn or whatever they could find. And my dad would set up a tent for a tent meeting and began preaching every night of the week. And then on Sundays, twice on Sundays. And in every one of these areas, they would put together a church. He would mortgage his houses to get enough money to build a church building, find a pastor to come in, to move in, and to take over this church, and then he'd go back to work, pay off his mortgage, and the next summer they'd go do it again. And they did this over and over and over. There wasn't a church that was bigger than 30, 35 people, ever. Interesting. He 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 always seemed to have more money than anybody could imagine. He bought a house after he sold the 6 houses and bought a farm for $25,000 in the middle of the Depression, and everybody was clamoring, "Where do you get that kind of money? Where do like he stole something or?" But he never took a salary from the churches. I mean, he was just all he did was serve and serve, and God blessed him and blessed him and blessed him, and none of it made sense. That's the important point here. It didn't make any sense as far. And when he died, he had an incredible, whopping estate to split between his family of $8,000 because he had given it all to the kingdom. Now, you can see how my life has been impacted by my predecessors. You can see how thinking might be stretched a little. He didn't live the American dream. He lived the kingdom dream. This was something different. This was something at a new level, which is what I want to talk to you about today. This is a new level thinking about money. This isn't practical, it's spiritual. It's not American, it's kingdom. It is powerful beyond imagination. Now, I'm going to give you some disclaimers real quick because I want you to understand how I think about money, and it came from where I came from. First of all, the Bible doesn't really give us any pat answers about money. It talks a lot about money, and we can pick up a lot of principles and ideas, but people who declare this is how it is are wrong because it's so much bigger than that. It's so much wider. It's so much, we do know that it can have a spirit of its own. Not always bad, but it is a powerful force in our lives. So, for instance, tithing. Jesus only mentioned it once in the New Testament. It was kind of in passing. It was like, oh yeah, you should tithe, but you really need to do these other things. I mean, that's all we can find in the New Testament about tithing. I'm not against tithing. I'm going to get to that in just a minute. But we have. I'm a pastor. I know I can say this. We can take Scripture and make it what we need it to be to get a good offering, and that's not necessarily a good thing, because there's so much more to this, and it's just not that simple. Debt. We have people who declare Bible's against debt. No, it's not. Not when you really study the Bible. 90% of the scriptures about debt in the Bible, 90%, isn't debt's evil. It shows you how to deal with debt. Sometimes it's to pay it off. Sometimes it's to use it for other gain. The Bible is not against debt. Only 10% of the scriptures talk about the danger of debt. And there is a danger with debt. I'm not, and you probably already know this by now, I'm not a Dave Ramsey fan. I don't think that the principles are all right. Now, I love things about Dave Ramsey, things that he teaches. There's some good things. And if you're in a disaster mode with consumer debt, you need to take the first course of the whole course of Dave Ramsey and let it speak to you. And if you are newly married, it's good to get a budget and to understand how this all works. But the whole thing is, okay, become debt-free so that you can do other things. Well, can I just be honest? It takes a lifetime to get debt-free in this country. If you buy a house, it's going to take you a lifetime for the most part, unless you have access to money that other people don't know about. So you've spent a whole lifetime trying to get to a place, and then you want to go do something important. It doesn't work that way. That's not good teaching. That's the strive and adapt and thrive idea that it's Americana. Napoleon Hill, Think and Grow Rich. I like that book. I've read it like 3 times. Just finished it recently again. Um, there's it. It's wacky in some ways, but there's secrets in there. It's kind of like Dave Ramsey. There's some good things. Keep the good, and the rest you throw out. Psychology of Money. Great book. You learn some things, but that's not what we live for. God has a plan for money. He has a plan for money. And he has a plan for you and his money. And I'll say this really quickly. My story is not going to be your story. Your story with God and money is going to be much different than mine. It's going to be much different than somebody else. But he has a plan. And so today, I just want to ask a couple of questions here. And I'm going to speed this up. What if you could live a different way? What if you could live with a different system, a different financial system? What if you could live without the fear, without all the stress, without the idea that that your esteem or your value is tied up? What if you could live with a plan, just a plan that is God's plan? And so I'm going to give you 3 things that I think can help you change your picture of money. It's not going to happen today. It's going to take work. It's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take faith. It's going to take vision. Number 1, you're going to love this. Give all of your money away. In other words, recognize that it is all God's and that you are simply a steward of his money. Operate as a steward, not an owner. You know what? A steward operates different than an owner. And inside of what I just said is the key to the plan that God has for you and your money. Give it away. Now, it's not as simple as it sounds. This almost, especially for those of us who are in our 30s, 40s, 50s, and on up, this is almost a conversion, a spiritual conversion with money. I'm not talking about salvation. I'm talking about entering a new place with God, with his kingdom, with money. It's a spiritual conversion to give the money away. I've had my plans. I've been on this trajectory. I've put this money away for this and this for this, and I got my plan. And the idea is to get to the end of life and die and be okay. John Piper talks about this, and remember the seashells and baseball, something, whatever. To get to retire, ride on a boat and get your seashells, and then you die. Oh my gosh, what a waste of life. What a waste of God's finances. So, give all of your money away. While doing that, there are a couple of things that help you begin to do that. The first one, I already mentioned, is, and this is number 2, build your trust in God to supply your needs. Build your trust in God to supply your needs by, number 1, tithing. Tithing. It's a starting place. As you give 10% of your income away, you're making a huge statement. God, I trust you to supply my needs. Now, I told you tithing's hardly mentioned in the New Testament. You know why? Because it's too restrictive. It's not because it's too much. It's too restrictive. Tithing is elementary. Tithing is just starting. It's just a starting point. But the principle is this. In Luke 12:34, what's it say? It says, where your money is, there's your heart. So, don't we have to change our heart to give God his money back? And so, when you tithe, it's a discipline. It's a great discipline. And as you do it, your heart begins to change. Do you want to live your life like the majority of Americans where you just get by until you die? Or would you rather live in a world where you've got God's blessings pouring out on you because you are all about his kingdom with your money? And I'm showing you how to get there. Tithing is the starting place. And if you're resistant to that, that's because it's your money. You own it. By God, I'm going to keep it. I'll give a little, all this stuff, right? That is not God's plan. That is not the heartbeat of a steward. That's a heartbeat of an owner who's driven by fear or other things. The other way that you can build this trust is to give to people who need money, who are broke, who are hurting, who are in desperation. You give them money because that's what God would do. He's got us here to do these things. Number 3, first of all, it was give all your money away. Second, build your trust in God to supply your needs. Third, start dreaming. This is when it gets fun. Start dreaming and praying about giving toward kingdom expansion. I just wrote this down. What can I do with God's money that would reach more people for his kingdom? What could I do? How could I make money to go inject it into this kingdom venture? What could God do through me? How could he use my gifts in such an astounding way that takes me way beyond my survive and adapt and thrive idea and takes me into kingdom expansion? What could I do? How could I dream? God, show me what that is. I've been praying that in my life for so long, and God just keeps pouring it on, pouring it on. I take a step, he gives me another step. It's just amazing what he does and how it works. Deep in the process of kingdom expansion resides money. It's his money. And yes, it involves other things as well, but money needs to be used. His money needs to be used for his kingdom. So finally, here's the proverb. We're going to close with this proverb. It's Proverbs 11, 24, 25, and 28. Give freely and become more wealthy. Be stingy and lose everything. We could just stop right there. Give freely, become more wealthy. Be stingy and lose everything. The generous will prosper. Those who refresh others will themselves be refreshed. Trust in your money, and down you go. But the godly flourish like leaves in spring. Now that phrase, give freely, it comes from a Hebrew word that means to just scatter, distribute widely. In other words, Solomon is saying, take your money and give it out, throw it out to people who need it. Even to the point that it actually infers, be careless with this. Be reckless with this when it comes to caring for others. It doesn't suggest tidiness or caution or care. The theaters have been opening up lately, and it's kind of nice. I always love taking Pam to see a movie, as long as I get to pick the movie. So we opened our post-COVID movie-going experience with Top Gun. God is in that movie. It was just so great. It was so fantastic. But I had to make a deal. We'd go to Top Gun, but we had to go to Elvis. That was awful. I mean, I got chocolate-covered raisins. That was the best part of the whole night. And then she cons me into this next chick flick called Where the Crawdads Sing. And I'm ashamed to say I loved it. And it's a story, I won't give you too much. You need to go see this. It's a story about a little girl that was abandoned. Her mother left. Her siblings ran from home. and her father ended up dying. And she was left in the marshlands of the outer banks of, I think it was North Carolina. And she was 10 or 11 years old, and she didn't have any way to provide for herself, and she didn't want to get sent to some kind of foster care. So she lived back in the marsh, and she would catch some fish or catch some crawdads or something and take it to this little store owned by a black couple. Jumpin' and Mabel were their names. They owned this store, and they quickly recognized that Kaya, which is her name, was in trouble. And so in the movie, and I had to write this down really fast, and then I went back and found out that I'd missed a bunch of words. In this, there was an interaction between Mabel and Jumpin'. I want to read it to you. Mabel, she's talking about this poor young girl. She goes, "Poor child. Her ma's gone, and now her pa's gone too." And Jumpin' knows where this is going, so he speaks up. "We ought to be careful messing in folks' business." And Mabel goes, "It don't say that in the Bible. Be careful." And then she starts quoting this. "And the king shall answer and say unto them, Verily I say unto thee, inasmuch as ye have done it unto the least of these, my brethren, ye have done it unto me." Jumpin' goes, "All right, Mabel, all right." And then just to finish it off, she goes, "It don't say about be careful." I don't know if I could come up with a better close for this message. It don't say be careful. How much faith can you have handling God's money? How much vision can you allow Him to give you with His money? When He says that He owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, He has infinite funding for kingdom ventures. This is not ours. It's not ours to spend. It's not ours to lose. It's not ours to play with and to build our own comfort. It's for ours to risk for the kingdom of God. My grandfather risked every time he mortgaged his house in the middle of the Great Depression to go start another church. He risked it all. There wasn't much margin. And it don't say, be careful. Let me pray. Lord Jesus, you've taught us that buried treasure is an affront to you. It is not your design. I ask, God, that you, as only you could do, change our hearts about your money. May it begin today, oh God. In Jesus' name, amen. Hey guys, we're done. You can leave. It don't say be careful. Bye. I'm serious. Go. I'm ready for all you have for me. All you have for me. No matter where you, as long as you're with me, I'm where I need to be. It's gonna get better. It's gonna get better. There's no mistake I could ever make. It's gonna
was blinded, you gave me eyes to see. I was going